Hi, welcome to my workshop. Today we're going to be looking at the Pine Creek General Store for microscale models. This is a great little kit, and I'll be building it for a customer of mine. It's made by Microscale Model and is still available. These are some of the manufacturer's photos of their general store. The only difference I'll be doing is changing a few colors, and I won't be putting the Pine Creek General Store sign on it. We'll have some different signs on the one I'm building. So let's see what comes in the kit. The instructions are 7 pages of 11 by 17, so there's a lot of coverage in how to build this. And you can see there's a lot that comes in this kit, and it's all nicely packaged in plastic bags. This is the wooden base that's styled to look like concrete. These are the tissue windows, along with laser cut glass and shades. Here are the roofing materials, shingles, and all of the Rafter Tails. This is foundation and some of the supports for the loading docks. And here you have the walls and the support structures. And this is some of the extra parts that come with it. Strip wood, chimney, etc. And you also get a whole bunch of extra detail parts that come along with it. So I started with step 1, which is putting the foundation of the building together. You have laser cut wood that looks like cinder blocks. So I sprayed it with the gray chalk color that makes it look like cinder blocks. And next I glued the foundation together. It's comprised of the foundation walls, some supports that go between them, and a subfloor assembly that sits on top, making the whole thing strong. Next I moved on to the walls. I used a razor blade to put in end lines where the clapboard met, and also to raise a few boards for a bit of a distressed look. And after I finished the main walls, I moved on to the back room walls. They have their own foundation and floor, and I did the same with them, putting in the board end lines and lifting a few of the clapboards. Next I used my ultimation slicer to cut some glue blocks and some bracing for the inside of the walls. Then I put the glue blocks on the ends of the side walls so they would join to the end walls. And I also put the bracing in to go from floor to ceiling. The kit comes with a second floor, so I notched it. At that point, I started gluing one of the side walls to the floor that comes in the kit. I then glued one of the end walls and attached it to the floor and the side wall, making sure everything is square and at a 90-degree angle. I then glued on the other end wall, making sure they were tight. And at this point, it's time to put in the second floor. Now it was made of task board. I had easily cut the notches in it for the bracing that I put in, but I also glued a support under it to make sure it stayed rigid. Once I glued it in place, I made sure it was level in both directions with my little levelers. Now it was time to glue on the fourth wall, again making sure everything was square and tight. The kit also comes with a ceiling, which I glued on, again making sure it was level. I now turned to gluing together the walls for the back room. And they were smaller, but it was basically the same process. I'd put in glue blocks and then glued the 3 walls together, making sure that they were square. They'll attach onto the back of the building at a later point. Now the kit comes with a ceiling that also goes on the back room, along with some roof supports that I glued on and clamped. And this is gluing the ceiling in place. It also came with the same type of roof supports that go on the main building. They go inside the gable ends and hold the roof decking in place. So it was just a matter of gluing them in place and clamping them. Then I moved on to the clerestory that goes on top of the roof. I used my Ultimation sander to put a bevel on the bottom of the side walls that matched the angle of the roof so that they would sit flush with it. Then after putting on glue blocks, I glued two ends onto the two side walls. While I was letting that dry, I moved on to gluing the roof onto the back room. And the roof supports that went in place hold the roof just flush with the top of the side walls. It's a very well engineered kit. Then I glued the two sub-assemblies of the clerestory together so that that piece was done. And while that was drying, I went and glued the roof decking onto the main building. And it sat perfectly inside the notches of those roof supports. And you can see here how it sits flush with the end walls. Then I went back to the clerestory and glued the ceiling in place on it. After the ceiling was glued in, I glued in the roof supports for the clerestory. And once they were in place and dried, I was able to glue the roof pieces onto the clerestory. So at this point I had all of my sub-assemblies done. I had the floors and the roofing glued onto all three pieces. So it was time to go in and start staining the floors of the main building and the back room. Now my finishing plan for the walls had been to stain all of them with Hunterline driftwood and then go over them with a light coat of parchment paint. I did a little testing to see how much of dry brushing I wanted to do to get the faded paint look I was after. So I then used a little bit of Liquitex Flow Aid to thin out my parchment paint and started dry brushing it on. The first piece I did was a clerestory, and it was coming out pretty nice. So I moved on to the back room, and I dry brushed the parchment paint on the three walls for it. And I liked the way that the parchment was going on, but I was noticing it was coming out a little brighter than I wanted. So I went through some of my stain samples and found that if I put a raw umber over the parchment after it was dry brushed on, it toned it down some and came out looking just like what I wanted. And this was the effect that I was getting at that point. So I decided to do that with all of my walls. I went back and put the raw umber over the clerestory and then started to dry brush the main building, putting it over the driftwood stain and then coming back afterwards when it was dry and putting the raw umber stain over it. And I liked the look that all of the walls were getting after I was done with that. So I put that aside and let all of that dry while I moved on to the next assembly. Next up were the windows. And we had decided on a brown color for the trim on this building. So I cut all the windows and doors off of the sprues and used a sanding stick to file down all of the little bumps. Then I used masking tape to attach them to cardboard so I can take them to my spray booth and put a Vallejo primer down on them. And then once the primer was dry, I took one of the windows to use as a test, and I brushed some Vallejo burnt umber onto it and then did a little bit of weathering to it to see how it would look in the building. And we were happy with that and how it was coming out. So I took all of the rest of the windows over to my spray booth and I sprayed burnt umber onto all of them. And then once I let it dry, I removed all of them from the masking tape. The next step was to take a gray and use a sponge to give a weathered and peeling paint effect to all the windows. And after I had done the clerestory windows, I put them in place to see how they looked. And I was happy with how they came out. So I proceeded to do that to all of the rest of the windows and doors that came in the kit. And once I had finished sponging the paint on all the windows and doors, it was time to start putting the acetate in place. It came with a very nice sheet with all of the pieces of acetate laser cut to size. I usually use the thin Tamiya cement to put them in place. I'll just put the piece of acetate down and then let the cement wick underneath it. And while putting glass in windows can be somewhat tedious, I find that using this method I can get through a lot of windows in a fairly short period of time. Now the next task was maybe one of the harder parts of this kit. You had to assemble the front entrance, which is made up of 5 parts plus the front doors. And I glued the doors in place first so that assembly would be nice and strong. Then I found the angle that they're supposed to sit at. There's a nice diagram in the directions showing how it goes together. And I used my Ultimation sander to bevel the edges of the front walls so that they would sit at the correct angle. Then I built a little jig that would hold the walls up in the correct alignment while I applied glue to them. Then I let it sit and dry, and after that I test fitted in the building, and it went in just like it was supposed to. I did have a few spaces from when I glued it together, so I used some plastic putty to fill those in. Then I sanded it smooth. But I did have to do that operation a couple of times. Next is the corner trim, and they supply it on a laser cut sheet. So after I cut all of the pieces out and sanded the edges to get rid of any nubs, I dry brushed them with my mixture of parchment and flow aid. Then I left them to dry, and once they had, I went over them lightly with a sanding stick, and with the laser board underneath showing through, it came out looking pretty good, especially once I put the raw umber stain on it. It ended up coming out looking like peeled paint, which is the look I was after. I first started putting the corner trim on the clerestory, first gluing the pieces onto the side walls, and then coming back and overlapping them while gluing the end wall pieces in place. Then I would clamp everything while it dried. I had to trim the very bottom of the corner trim so that it would meet up with the right angle for the roof. Then I checked to make sure everything would sit right. Next I moved to the back room, and using the same method I applied the corner trim onto the end walls and then onto the side walls there. And I had to sand the top of them to the correct angle. To attach the corner trim to the main building, I first glued them on the side walls and clamped them in place while they dried. Then I glued the trim onto the end walls and also held them in place with clamps. Next it was time to glue the structure onto the foundation from the earlier step. So I just glued the floor to the subfloor and clamped it in as many positions as I could. And then it was time to glue the foundation onto the back room. And while that was clamped in place, I also glued the back room onto the main building, it being held in place by a couple of slots. Then I also included some corner trim where the two walls met. The next step was to put the hinges on the freight doors. So I first painted them a dark brown. Then after that paint had dried, I used some AK rusting over them. And then once I glued them on the door, I put a little more rust streaks coming down from them onto the door. Now it was time to paint the front entrance. So after priming the whole unit, I went ahead and airbrushed the burnt umber onto it. Now it was time to glue all the window shades in place. Since I was gluing them directly onto the window frames, I used a liquid PSA. Once you apply it and let it dry, you won't get any glue squeezing out. And I didn't want any showing up on the windows. So once I had all the window shades in place, I test fit a couple of them to make sure they'd fit in the openings the way I had mounted the window shades. Now I cut a piece of cardboard and threaded it through the second-story windows to act as a view block. So if you were looking inside one of the second-story windows, you wouldn't be seeing out the other side. I also was thinking that with all those windows at the front entrance, I wasn't sure how easy you'd be able to see the interior of the building. So I did a series of mock-ups for the interior using the computer in Photoshop. As it turns out, once I was done with the kit, I found you really can't see inside it very well, between the overhangs and all the shadows inside. Still, I enjoy making these mock-ups for the inside of buildings. Next I went back to the windows. I did something that I like to do to make windows look dirty. I'll take a little bit of a light brown acrylic paint and thin it quite a bit with a flow aid, and then just brush it on the windows. And once it dries, it can give a very good impression of windows that haven't been cleaned in quite a while. You can see on the left-hand side the one that's been treated versus the one on the right. When they were all dry, I started gluing my windows in place. For doing this, I just used a tacky glue and a toothpick to run around the inside of the opening and then stick the window in place. You could also use an Elmer's glue or a canopy glue for this operation. I also glued in place the front entrance. Now it was time to start working on the roof, and this involved a number of different operations. The first thing I did was I spray painted my roof panels a dark brown. And then on the underside of them, I drew a grid. This was going to be used later for putting my Rafter Tails in place. Next up was to work with the shingles. They give you these large sheets of laser cut shingles, but to add some variety to them, I like to use Copic markers for this. I've shown how to use Copic markers a couple times in the past, and because they can be very transparent, you can add shading and build up the colors that you want. For these shingles, I used a variety of light grays and a couple of light tans. The kit also comes with sheets of transfer tape that you can use to attach the shingles. You could also use glue for this. And you can see here the effect of adding shading to the shingles before they're cut out and applied. I like using Copic markers. You could also use pastels or thinned out paint. So I went ahead and glued the roof onto the clerestory. That was the first roof that I had applied the shingles on. I wanted to see how they looked before I tackled the main building. So I then used my Copic markers on all the rest of the shingles and started applying them to the main building's roof using the same process. I had marked where the clerestory goes, so I'd work around that section. Also, once you get up to the peak of the roof, the last row of shingles I would apply and then cut the top strip off. And I then glued the roof onto the main building, doing first one side and then the other. I then set the clerestory on the unshingled area to make sure it fit there. This is better than having it sit on top of the shingles. Next came the rolled roofing. My standard approach for this is to give it a mixture of gray and black spray paint and then go over the edges of it with some sandpaper to get a rough finish. I then used glue to attach it to the roof of the back room, overlapping the rough edges. I sprayed the roof trim and the rafter tails with the same camouflage brown I used on the roof panels. Then I applied glue to the roof trim and put them in place on the clerestory and the gable end of the main building. It was okay that the ends overhung. I'd use a pair of nippers to cut those off the same way I'd cut the rafter tails once I put them on. Now I started applying the rafter tails, and this is where all of the lines that I had put on the underside of the roof really helped out. If you've ever done a lot of rafter tails, you know you want to get them all evenly spaced, but sometimes trying to figure that out after the roof is mounted on the building can be difficult. Planning ahead really helped here. I had a few rafter tails that I had to put a notch in where they were up against the building. They were sitting right over windows that came very close to the roof, but this worked. And then once I had all the rafter tails attached to both sides of the roof, I came along with a pair of clippers and cut all of them off, even with the edge of the roof panel. Then I had to attach all of the gable end supports underneath the roof as well. Next up was to put a trim strip around the opening on the front of the building. These were the same pieces of trim that I used for the corner trim. Then I glued the roof onto the back room, used weights to hold it in place while it dried. Then, again, using the lines I had drawn on the underside of the roof, I put all of these rafter tails in place. Next, I had to make the lamps for the building. There were two different styles to be made, and they used tissue shades. I had made a lamp jig years ago that I use whenever I need to make these type of lamps. It makes sort of a production line assembly of them very easy. Then afterwards I had painted the shades and the supports black and painted the insides a cream color. Then when that dried, I put a light rust wash on the inside of the lights. The next step was to glue the clerestory onto the roof. To hold this down, I put tape on a couple 1, 2, 3 blocks and let that wait until the glue dries. One neat detail it comes with are tie rod anchors. that I just weathered and applied to the walls. Next was the base. They had laser etched concrete blocks into the base, but they weren't quite deep enough, so I went over them with an X-Acto knife. I found that gray paint didn't cover the grain in the wood very well, so I used a Krylon khaki camouflage, and this came out looking pretty good for concrete. Then I put glue all around the bottom of the foundation and glued it down to the base. Next I started working on the chimney. This is a cinder block chimney. And the first thing I did was I used my Ultimation sander to sand a bevel at the top. I did this to match the size of the chimney cap that would fit on it. Then I used a knife to dig out under where the chimney cap was going to sit, so it would look like it was open underneath it. The next thing I did was spray it with a gray chalky finish. Once I was done with that, I noticed a few mistakes in their laser etching of the chimney. There were a couple places where they had blocks meeting right at the very edge. So I went in and filled those with some plastic putty. So once the putty was dry, I came back with my X-Acto knife and cleaned out the mortar lines. Then to put the mortar into the chimney, I used a distress crayon. I have other videos showing how to use these to put mortar in bricks. Once I had finished putting it all in and let it dry, I was done with the chimney. The next area to work on was the loading dock and front porch. These are interesting the way they engineered them. You have a series of deck supports, and then you also have the footers that would be painted to look like concrete blocks. I first glued one set of support footers onto the deck supports, and then glued the second set on, and I clamped them while all the glue dried. And this shows how the support for the porch assembly came out. Then I did the same thing with the two pieces that make up the loading dock supports. I then put glue to the footers of the front porch and glued it in place. And then I did the same with the side loading dock and used weights to hold them down while the glue dried. The kit came with a piece of laser board that was pre-cut to be the decking for the porch and the loading dock. But I wanted to use my own boards and stain them randomly so they'd have variation. So I cut some scale 1/6 to length and then used a variety of stains to weather them all slightly differently. Then I glued them all down in place in a random pattern, and it came out looking better than the one piece of laser board would have. And I did the same to the side loading dock, choosing not to use the pre-cut piece that had come with the kit. I used strip wood instead, and again stained it randomly, and then glued them down in place on the loading dock platform. Next I installed the chimney. In order to do this, I had to cut a small slot out of the roof so the chimney would sit flush with the building. Then once I had it fitting perfectly inside the slot, I went ahead and glued it in place, making sure it was perfectly plumb. Next up was building the stairs. I first stained the risers and then used my slicer to cut all of the treads to fit on them. I then used a jig I have to build the stair sets. I needed 5 of them in total. And there are concrete stairs that lead from the door of the back room, so I sprayed them with the camouflage khaki. And then once that was dry, I glued them in place. The next items were some hydrocal cast detailed parts to go on the back room, a couple of roof vents and a sidewall vent. For the sidewall vent, I opened up one end of it so it would look like it had an opening. Then after gluing the cyclone vents together, I stuck them all on a piece of masking tape and gave them a base coat of black. Then I came back and gave them a light overspray of silver. Then I went over them all with some dirty down rust solution. Then I painted the opening of the sidewall vent and glued it onto the side wall of the back room, using some ACC to hold it in place. I did a little more weathering on the roof vents, and then when they were dry, I glued them onto the roof of the back room. There'd be more weathering to come for them. Now it was time to work on the roofs over the loading dock and the front porch. It comes with supports and a roof truss system and the roof sheeting. I think they gave me an extra one of those that I didn't need. So I first painted my roof sheeting a brownish gray. Then I did some staining on the roof supports. And then after they were glued in place, I applied stain to the roof truss system that was underneath it. Then I cut out all of my roof supports and did the same for the rolled roofing on top of the roofs that I had done for the back room. The next step was gluing the roof supports to the roof truss system. And they had scribed lines on the truss to show where all the supports would go. Then you added a long beam to the front of all the supports. Now we needed holes for the wires that were going to hold this up, and I figured they'd be easier to drill before it was mounted on the building. So I measured where they were all going to go and then drilled the holes for the wires. Next I glued the supports onto the roof that went over the loading dock. And just as I had done for the porch roof, I used a couple of blocks to make sure each one that I glued was straight and upright. And then when they were all in place, I glued the same beam to the front of the supports. Now it was time to glue the porch roof in place. I had to make sure that it was going to be a strong connection and it was going to be even and level. The bottom of the supports were able to rest on the trim that I had put around the opening. So I applied glue to the back of all of the roof supports and then tipped the building up so that the roof would be holding itself in place while it was drying. And then I left it angled up overnight to let the glue dry. So next I got ready to glue the roof on over the loading dock. This one didn't have a trim board like on the front porch to go under the supports, so I glued one in place and made sure that it was level and at the right height where the roof supports could sit on it. Then I went ahead and put the glue on the back of all the roof supports like I did on the front porch and tilted the building up so that it was supporting itself while the glue was drying. And the board that I had put underneath the roof supports helped hold it in place. Next it was time to work on the wires that supported the roofs. I first spray painted them a gray color, and I had spray painted the turnbuckles a darker gray. Then I started to cut them to length and put them together. The turnbuckles just slid right over the wire, but in a few places they were a little tight and scraped off the paint that I had put on. Then I bent all the ends so that they'd go into the walls and into the roof without actually bending the wire. Once I started putting them in, I just put a little bit of super glue on both ends and put them in place. And I was able to put a little more super glue underneath the ones that went through the roofs. Then it was time to start rusting the wires, the turnbuckles, and where they attached. And for doing this I used MIG's oil brusher. It makes it easy to apply the rust onto the wire, and then to have the rust run down onto the roof and onto the walls. Now I needed to mount the lights that go into the porch. And I just glued 2 little squares of laser board under there that I had painted gray, and then stuck the lights through some holes I had drilled in them and glued them in place. At this point I started doing some of the weathering to the building using artist pigments. They're one of the products that I like to use for applying weather to a structure. I first started out by putting some soot around the top of the chimney and some other dirt coming down the chimney and onto the roof. Then I started using my browns and grays onto the side of the building. And I'd just use my soft brushes to pull down some streaking and some rusting where some metal items would be mounted. And I started putting some dirt and wear tracks on the porch and the loading dock. I also at this point wanted to see how easy it was to see inside the building now that all the porch roofs were on. I had to end up shining a light inside the building just to be able to see anything. So I don't think my interior work was really worth it unless you were going to light up the inside of the building. Another neat detail that the kit has is some electrical hookup. It includes a couple different electric meters, some insulators on a piece of wood, some string for hooking them up. I was going to use the wooden box, so I went ahead and spray painted it and the insulator block a gray. Then I dry brushed them to look like wood. And then once I was done with that, I painted the insulators a green. The next thing I did was bent the wire that came with it so that it would go down to the electrical box and up to feed into the insulators. I mounted the electrical box, and I used a little guy there to make sure I was putting it at the right height. Then I used some liquid PSA to mount the wire in place. That way you don't get any oozing glue underneath it. Then I glued a few pieces of the thread onto the end of the wire that I had. I had to hold this in place while the super glue was drying, even with accelerator. But when it was done, I had my threads attached to the piece of wire, so I could feed them over to the insulators. And this was a tricky process, making sure I got them held in place while I used the super glue. But with a couple attempts, I was able to get them attached to the insulators. The next thing I did was to do a little bit of weathering on all the electrical pieces with some rust for the conduit that went up and some dirt running down from where the box and the insulators are. Next I went and added some sealant around the roof where the chimney goes through it. I like using this gallery glass product for sealing around chimneys and other roofing pieces. Next, I had put together some signs that the customer wanted on the building. Then I used a little gouache to put some rust on them, first using a sponge and then doing some streaking with a brush. Then once they were cut out, I went around the edges with a marker so you didn't see the white edge of the paper. Then I set them all out and decided where would be the appropriate places to mount them. Before putting them on the walls, I used a very sharp pencil to poke the four corners so they'd look like mounting nails. Then I just used canopy glue on the back of them to go ahead and glue them in place. I always think at this point, this is when the building starts to come alive. I then used the gallery glass again to put sealant around the vents on the back room where they came through the roof. This stuff is easy to work with, and I'll usually just apply it with a toothpick. The last sign to apply was the business company's name. This business was a coal company that was run by my customer's railroad. I printed out a number of them and doubled up on the sheet size, and then used some gouache for rust where the mounting holes would be. Then I used some liquid PSA on the back to hold the sign in place. And then once I had it in place, I did some weathering to the sign and around it. One of the last things to apply was some very finely ground up oak leaves. I'll scatter this around the base of a building and then just dribble on some alcohol, and once it dries it holds them in place without leaving any residue. I'll do this whenever I have a building that's sitting on concrete or some type of platform where it's attached to it. The kit comes with some really nice hydrocal cast details and some laser cut skids that you can put together. I put together a few of the skids, but I haven't got to the hydrocal details yet. This was quite an enjoyable and a very involved kit to build. I'm really happy that I did it, and I appreciate you watching.